is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jennifer Ott. Jennifer Ott is well known to many of you through her scholarship, her work at HistoryLink.org, and her community involvement. Her contributions are too numerous to describe today, but I will give you a brief overview. Jennifer is an environmental historian and holds a master's in environmental and Western American history. In addition to the book that we'll be hearing about today, Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City, Jennifer is also the co-author with David Williams of Waterway, The Story of Seattle's Lock and Ship Canal. She is also the editor and co-author of Seattle at 150, which was recently released. I'd say it's quite a feat to write two books at the same time. She's also a contributor of articles on Washington State history to HistoryLink.org. I think she now has over 500 articles on HistoryLink, to Seattle Magazine, and to the Oregon Historical Quarterly. In addition to her valuable scholarship, Jennifer is the past president and current board member of Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks. She also serves as a member of the steering committee of the Volunteer Park Trust. I am delighted that Jennifer is going to share her deep knowledge of Seattle's Olmsted Parks with us today. I can attest to her meticulous and thorough research based on the hundreds of hours that she has spent up in the Seattle room doing work up there. I have no doubt we are in for an engaging and informative talk. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's so much fun to get out from behind my computer and actually get to talk to people. I do spend a lot of time with files and documents and old books, and the story that you pull out of those old records is often very exciting, and it's fun to share them on HistoryLink, and it's especially fun to have a book in hand to share. And so I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, but first, since this is our book launch and we're very excited to actually have the book in hand, I want to take a minute to thank some people. The first is the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks, which initiated this project. We have a table here of information. It's a great organization. I've enjoyed being involved with it over the years. HistoryLink, of course, which provides such an amazing venue for historians like me to share our stories with the public. And Peter Beck, who is our publisher with Documentary Media, he is remarkable not only in just the details and intricacies of publishing, but also in, he knows how to tell a story. He knows how to take the text and add the pictures and make it so visually compelling that you just get pulled into it. And so it is a pleasure to work with him. And then I'm so excited that we're doing this at the library because librarians and archivists are just such an important part of the work that I do. Anne Ferguson, of course, with the Seattle Room, the Seattle Municipal Archives, the UW Special Collections, archives across the country, the Library of Congress, the National Park Service. We have almost an embarrassment of riches about the Olmstead brothers and their history. And so I am so appreciative of those people that keep those records and share them with us. I also would have to thank the list that is too long to list here of donors that supported the publication of this book. There's nothing inexpensive about publishing a book, and because of those donors, we were able to get this project started and make it come to fruition. And then, of course, I have a bunch of friendly faces in this audience, and I have to thank my friends who are remarkable and always interested in the work that I'm doing, which is a gift to have friends like that. And then my family, who is here, my husband Brad and my boys Henry and Elliot, who have withstood me doing 2 books in 1 year, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone. So thank you to everyone. I'll start way back with this map from 1891. So for a long time, Seattle was a fairly small town, and nature was right at our doorstep, and that sort of dichotomy that we maybe don't adhere to now, but then was certainly true, that you have the city and you have the country. And so maybe not in the earliest years, it was a huge priority to get park land. But before long, as the city was growing, city leaders realized that we needed to have park space within the city. And it's not just because it's nice, it's because it's a really important part of being a healthy city. If you want to have a democracy that is built upon participation of the masses, then you need to have a mentally and physically healthy populace, and parks are an essential part of that. The Olmsted firm had been very important in carrying out, or bringing that message to the public, and Seattle leaders were certainly aware that to be a real city, you had to have a park system. There's a great report in the newspaper where 3 city leaders go to Cleveland for a Congress, and they come back and they report to the public through the newspaper that we are behind. We need to get a park system. And so it's all tied up in wanting to have those beautiful spaces, but also wanting to be a real city. So the first time that you see the proposal for an actual park system, which is different than, say, establishing Denny Park or the Kinnears donate Kinnear Park, those smaller spaces. In the 1890s, the city is very aware that they need a park system. And the first person to put one together is Edward Schwagerl, who was our first sort of professional park superintendent. And this is a map from 1894, but it shows you where, the purple line shows you where the city limits are. And this is Schwagerl's plan. He wants to put one big park at Sandpoint, and he wants to put another where Bailey Peninsula was, it's now Seward Park, one out at Alki Point, and a 4th at Discovery Park. Well, what was then West Point, it wasn't even Fort Lawton yet. And so you have those 4 parks, 4 large parks. Notice that all of them are, except for the West Point one, are outside the city limits. And he wanted them to be connected with a boulevard, a parkway that would have connected all 4. The challenge is that he really wanted that parkway to go along the shoreline, which put him right away at odds with the industrial development. And as much as Seattle wants a park system, they really want an industrial base, and they want a port. And so this was challenging, and he proposed this in 1892. The Chamber of Commerce was very excited about it. They figured they could work out the details if they could just start moving toward a goal, and this was a plausible goal to work toward. But then the Panic of 1893 came along, and that was essentially an economic depression, a very, very significant one, and just brought all development to a screeching halt, and there certainly wasn't money in the city budget for park acquisition or development. So the project sort of simmered. It wasn't forgotten, but it simmered, and nothing really happened on it. Interestingly, at the same time, in 1893, this is when there was the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was the landscape architect for that fair. And this is the nucleus, the very start of the idea of City Beautiful. This idea that you can design a city that is beautiful to live in, and it's orderly, it's clean. Different uses are allocated to different spaces in order to not have that overlap that would be disruptive to living spaces. And people fell in love with it. They loved the White City of the Columbian Exposition, and the idea caught on, but just as in Seattle, the Panic of 1893 waylaid any thoughts of developing City Beautiful plans. And so the 1890s kind of roll along. Seattle was not growing very quickly, but then we get the Klondike Gold Rush, 1897. Those are boxes of gold coming back from Alaska. Kind of makes you think of that little pouch that you normally associate with gold miners, and these guys have boxes. And that influx of capital and that onrush of people that you see starting to come into Seattle, we go from about 43,000 people in 1890 to 237,000 people by 1910. And we think we're going through a crazy period of growth. That was just gangbusters. And I particularly think of it as, at that time, if you came to Seattle from somewhere else, you either came through the train stations on the waterfront or all up and down the waterfront, or you came by ship. And so you came to those piers on the waterfront. And just that massive influx of people that are streaming into the city. And very quickly you get a sense of thrill, right? It's all of a sudden it's like, oh, money. Seattle can be a jumping off point. We can make money off the gold miners more than we can probably make as gold miners. And so they're happy to see the development, but people realize that if land is not purchased for parks, then it will be gone, right? At that time, it's still true today to a degree, but at that time particularly, once a parcel of land becomes a home or a business, it's not going to be turned back into a park. And at the same time, property values are rising tremendously. And so people that are wanting to see a park system developed are realizing that they won't be able to if they don't get the property as soon as possible. So you start to see some movement toward this. We have some parks that are developed in this era. We have Kinnear Park is donated. Woodland Park is purchased by the city. And Denny Park, this is, that's the lower right one. This is before the regrade. So quite the different landscape than it is today. And we have those isolated parks. And there's the private parks. There's Leschi and Madison Park and Madrona Park at the end of the trolley lines. But the city cannot seem to get momentum going in order to have all the pieces come together that it takes to get a park system off the ground. And that's, how are they going to govern that park system? How are they going to find money to acquire that park system and develop it? And who's going to run it? There's a lot of the spinning of the wheels going on in the 1890s, 1900s, early 1900s. And my favorite example of this is from the city archives. The document on the left there is the annual report by Melody Choir in 1901. That should be the annual report by the Board of Park Commissioners. But Melody Choir and C.D.C. Williams were the only two commissioners that were showing up at, well, you can't even call them meetings because they actually couldn't decide enough to even have meetings together. They did not like each other at all. They wrote dueling annual reports and basically criticizing the fact that the Board of Park Commissioners had no real power. They couldn't make any decisions. They couldn't decide how they were going to raise funds. They couldn't decide what would be purchased. That was all that power was in the city council, which are the folks on the right, doing an inspection tour in 1900. They're in Kinnear Park there at a table that they set up for a picnic. And so there's a real tension that goes on, and that isn't resolved until about 1901. They get a new mayor comes into office, there's enough money, there's a real sense of urgency by 1901 that the land is disappearing at a really rapid rate. And so this mayor is able to get a new Board of Park Commissioners established. They don't have more power as yet, but they are a type of person that is used to seeing things get done. And so there's Elbert Blaine, who was a prominent lawyer, Charles Saunders, who was an architect, civil engineer Charles Fowler, business owner J. Edward Shrewsbury, and Melody Choir finished out his term. They couldn't get rid of him. He was quite a fellow. His neighbors petitioned to have his house burned down. He was an eccentric. He tormented them, and so he was quite a character. But they had to live with him. They couldn't kick him out. And so, but those other members of the Board of Park Commissioners are people that are used to running projects. They're used to getting things done. They're used to managing money and making things happen. And so they make a plan and they send this letter to prominent Seattleites who would be most affected if a property tax was instituted to fund park acquisition. And basically the letter is asking people to let them know, would you support this idea that we would increase the powers of the Board of Park Commissioners, we would give the Board of Park Commissioners more money through taxation, and then the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published an article, full-page article, where they listed some of the quotes from people who responded to that letter, and it was fairly unanimously positive. The idea that they know they need a city park system, that's a pretty well-established fact, and the fact that things are growing so quickly really coalesced the movement forward, especially because the City Beautiful movement generally, that outgrowth of the Columbian Exposition, was really picking up steam across the country. And so one of the quotes from this is that the goal was to hire a professional. This is very much that era of looking for expertise and bringing people in to advise. And they want that person to have, to develop a plan, and so they could have all future work done in harmony with that scheme, whether done now or 100 years from now. So they're not looking for something that's going to happen the next day, but they know that if they don't articulate what they want, then it's not going to happen. And so, as often happens in Seattle, they looked east, particularly in this era. This is an era when that sort of stamp of legitimacy comes from the East Coast. And so they're aware enough, and there's enough people that are here from the East Coast who have recently moved to Seattle, that they know that the Olmsted name is the one that they should look to. And that's because of the work of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. He's known as the father of landscape architecture. He is, has done so many prominent landscapes across the country, and he was a prolific writer and speaker, and so his message was well conveyed across the country. And so, however, by 1902, 1903, he had retired, and instead there is a new firm. And so after he, in 1903, when they go to look for a firm on the East Coast, they look for the Olmsted name and they find the Olmsted Brothers. And that is a firm that was formed by John Charles Olmsted, who's pictured here. He began working with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. in 1875 when he graduated from college. And he was well steeped in the Olmsted view, the Olmsted principles of design, by working with his stepfather and uncle. Frederick Law Olmsted married his brother's widow. And so they worked closely together. And then after his retirement, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. joined together with John Charles Olmsted to form the Olmstead Brothers firm. And so when Seattle goes looking for its landscape architect, its expert, to develop a park system plan, they go for the Olmsted firm. It takes a little bit of time to work out the details, but the reason that they go and look for, or the reason that that is such an important part of this story is that Olmsted name is that it comes with more than just sort of technical skill. It comes with a vision of what a park system should encompass, what landscape design actually means. And this postcard is, I think, one of the best examples of that Olmsted vision. This is the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition's Court of Honor, that central plaza. And you see Drumheller Fountain today. It was then the Geyser Basin, and it looks down across the vista, off to the foothills and out to Mount Rainier. And that's the, to me, sort of the epitome of the Olmsted vision. That captures that genius of place that we have in an Olmsted design. When Olmsted looked at how he would put together a design, he looked for what is it particularly about this place that is valuable. Instead of imposing an outside vision, look at what is in the place that you're designing and understand what makes it special. He also looked at the orchestration of movement, that the landscape design should subtly direct people through a landscape. So you don't have to think about where you're going, you just gently follow the path or the drive. And there's an interesting quote in Olmsted Sr.'s work about compare that to a sidewalk and how bustling and crowded a city sidewalk is at that time. And that if that's your whole day, then when you go to a park, you should be able to meander and find your way through without having to be careful of where you're headed. The comprehensive approach is that you should take a composition, a landscape design, and it should consider both the park itself and how it functions, but also how it relates to its surroundings. And that's twofold. One is to think about how the park interacts with the streets and the community that immediately surrounds it, but also how the park system as a whole works together. And so you should have different kinds of parks that are connected in different ways and that can be used by different people in different ways, and so that you have a whole of a park system that works well together. The orchestration of use is an important part of making sure, again, that people aren't overlapping each other, that it's orderly and easy to enjoy the most that you can out of that particular landscape. A good example is Volunteer Park, where you have that very programmed, more formal space along the top of the ridge and at the northern end of the park. But then you also have the spaces outside of that area that are the more pastoral and contemplative spaces. And so if you put the tennis courts right there smack in the middle of the great lawn, neither would get to enjoy their uses very well. But because you put the tennis courts up where more of the program spaces, that's a well-designed use, and then the lawn is available for contemplative experiences. The unified composition principle is that you should take the elements of the landscape design, all the different pieces that come into any landscape that you're designing, and make sure that they are subordinate to the vision that you have for the whole. So there's not randomness to it, that it all speaks to the goals of that particular landscape. And you see that in the Seattle park system with the different parks all have very specific purposes. It drove him crazy, Olmsted, when he first came to Seattle, and he went to Kinnear Park and Denny Park and what was then City Park, or no, it had been changed to Volunteer Park. And he said it was just the same design over and over again. There was no clarity about what was special about that place, what was the purpose of that place, because Schwagerl had a bit of a tendency to drop rocks into the landscape and plunk planting beds in random places. Absolutely drove Olmsted insane. So, and then the last one is one that, as a historian, you have to be careful about attributing thoughts and goals to people that are anachronistic. And so I would never say that Olmsted was an environmentalist. That's not what sustainable design and environmental conservation mean to Olmsted. Instead, they mean design a space so that the things that you're putting there will sustain themselves. They fit with the landscape. You can regrade landscapes in an Olmsted design. You can move waterways. He wanted to move the brook in Washington Park to better fit the design. But still, you want to do it in a way that it doesn't require constant tending and that it makes sense with the place that it is surrounded by. And so you don't see many places that are today have to be tended from that perspective. We have to beat back the invasive plants, but we don't have to worry so much about sort of a false compatibility with our landscape. And so with all those principles in mind, Olmsted came to Seattle and he designed a park system. And this feels like the lightning speed version of this. In the book, of course, there's more detail, but just to give you the short version, in 1903, Olmsted designed a plan, and it's a happy day. The reason we chose today for the book launch is that this is the anniversary of when the city council adopted the plan in 1903, and it's also the 35th anniversary of the founding of the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks, which I'm sure was carefully planned for that day. And so that 1903 plan was developed, and then in 1908, Olmsted was invited back to do a supplemental plan because the city had grown by those annexations to the north and the south. And, but both plans are essentially the same components. They have the large parks, the ones that you'd recognize on the map here, Washington Park, Jefferson Park, Green Lake and Woodland Parks, then Discovery Park today, Fort Lawton Military Reservation at the time. And then those are connected by boulevards, which are essentially, they're called at the time attenuated parks. That idea that the thread of parkway brings the park experience throughout the city. And so no one is ever too far away from getting to the park experience. So you don't have to travel on Aurora to get to the beautiful park. You get to, hopefully, that part did not get developed as well, but you can go along something like Lake Washington Boulevard, much closer to your home, and then enjoy the park experience all the way to the parks. You'll see that it was fairly optimistic about what would happen in South Seattle. That, unfortunately, parts of that did not get developed because of changes in Board of Park Commissioners' goals, and also just sort of the historical development of those landscapes. But it is great fun to go to the Friends of Seattle's Olmstead Parks website and look at the park descriptions, because quite a number of our existing parks are the realization of parts of those boulevards. The little bits that we were able to get in, even if the giant connecting parkway was not put. That's why when you move through Seattle's park system, it feels like you're at least able to follow continuous, sort of leapfrog your way through the city between parks. The third element were the neighborhood parks. The goal was to have a playground, park, small area within a half mile of every house. And so We've reached that goal in quite a few parts of our cities. There's some parts of the city where we're still working on that. But the idea is that you need to be able to get to these spaces very close to your home. They're also, Olmsted laid out the goal of having a play field within a mile of every home. And that's for, he said, for grammar school boys. We would include the girls today, of course. But the idea of having ball fields so that you don't have to just find a sand lot to do a pickup game of baseball, but you can have a place that is both utilitarian, has space for those games, but that is also beautiful. He argues pretty strenuously against the park system taking over schoolyards, because those are very specific function spaces, and there's not a lot of room for landscaping in a schoolyard. And he really believed that every landscape, no matter what it was programmed for, should have space for beauty. I love his explanation of Jefferson Park. He called for ball fields there, perfect place for ball fields, wide open space, nice and level. But he also wanted there to be a fringe of plants. And on one side, he wanted more native plants, and on the other side, he wanted more ornamentals on either side of the park. But then he wanted there to be gaps between those plantings so that you could enjoy the views out to the east and the west. At that time, you could see Lake Washington from the eastern side of the park. And so it's a ball field, right? It's a place for kids to come together for team sports, but it's also a place where they can get access to beauty and that restorative character of nature. And so we had those two park system plans to work with, the Board of Park Commissioners did. And then Olmsted, during all of these years, between 1903 and 1913, is developing individual park system plans. He's writing letters of advice about how landscapes should be developed. He discouraged them from using engineers too often to actually implement the plans because they were perhaps a little too efficient. He wants they want the park board to embrace the inefficient, the meandering roadways, the cutting into the hillside only and as necessary, and instead following the contours of the earth when you're building a boulevard, so that you get that weaving experience of in and out. If you think of Lake Washington Boulevard, as you weave your way along the lakeshore, you get some places where you get an expansive view and other places where you're more in the vegetation. And so it's not that you're just going to clear that view. It's more that you're going to have places where you're going to come in and out of it. And so, and he gives generally advice to the Board of Park Commissioners about how to get more power. He helps them develop a charter amendment so that they can have more control over the management of the park system. He helps them find a park superintendent who he had worked with at both Louisville and in New York. And so they bring John Thompson out here to do the superintendent work. And so all of those things come together, and you see just a massive burst of activity. There's one big push before the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909, and then the continued work as they were able to pass bond measures after that. In 1910, they invite Olmsted to prepare a playgrounds report. And this is, there were playgrounds in both of the first two reports that he prepared for the city, but this particular one was a focus on, okay, how do we make sure that there are play fields with field houses and developed facilities all throughout the city? And I love this. As a parent, it gives you a heart attack. If you notice, there's not even bark underneath them. Kids bounce better then, I guess. And but the idea is that you would get spaces for larger kids to be able to have space to do programmed activities. And the playground movement was growing across the country, and Seattle had, Austin Griffiths was writing just constant letters to the City Council and the Board of Park Commissioners. And so they focused their efforts, particularly in 1910, on developing that plan. And so as a result of all that work, we get an amazing park system. It starts to come to fruition. Like I said, by 1909, large parts of it are in place. The top left is Lake Washington Boulevard looking north toward Coleman Park. Mount Baker Park is in the foreground. And that's one of those, the shoreline access that we get because of that. I often sort of half in jest joke that I could never afford to get to Lake Washington or have those views. that we get because of Lake Washington Boulevard if we hadn't had Olmsted's vision and sort of that stamp of legitimacy that pushed that forward. There were people that didn't want necessarily to see a boulevard along Lake Washington. They instead would like to have seen that be more industrial. And so that vision gave the park board the momentum to develop landscapes like that. The one on the top right is, that's Foster Island near Washington Park, Arboretum. And that's another access to waterfront, but also those almost secluded areas right in the middle of the city, right? When you go to Foster Island, even though you can hear the freeway there, it's still like you're getting away from the city when you're there. The lower left is Interlochen Boulevard. I wish so much we still had that rustic railing. But we do have that amazing landscape of largely native vegetation surrounding the parkway headed down into the Montlake neighborhood. And then the lower right, of course, is Volunteer Park, which is the most intact and one of the most developed Olmsted landscapes in Seattle. That structure to the right is the pergola that Olmsted designed with a concert grove. That was replaced in 1932 by the Art Museum, of course. But I want you to particularly notice on the left of that postcard, those amazing plantain beds that terrace down to the reservoir. That's on my list of before I die, I hope to see those back in place. Hopefully it'll be before that. So I'm just going to give you a quick tour of some of these landscapes with pictures from today that you'll see how we, this sort of the life cycle of the park system. It's just what Olmsted intended. It's perhaps loved a little bit more, worn a little bit more than he would prefer, but it's pretty amazing what we have. And this idea of the native plants that we have along our boulevards, notice these particularly when you're along those boulevards that go down hillsides. So think of Cheesty Boulevard and Interlochen, of course, and Carkeek Drive, which is not technically a park boulevard, but it is a realization of Olmsted's vision for connecting Beacon Hill with Rainier Beach. And so in those areas, those are native trees, and you really get to enjoy that untrammeled wilderness feeling. Compare that to Montlake Boulevard, which he designed in a much more structured, formal, straight line way, particularly that area between Lake Washington Boulevard and the university campus. And that's because that is a parkway that is in the middle of the residential district, and so the character of the boulevard matches the surrounding. That gets back to one of those Olmsted design principles. Interlochen Boulevard was supposed to be the first boulevard that was developed, but they ran into a bit of a snag with property ownership because property values were going up so tremendously quickly. And so instead they turned their attention to Washington Park and invited the Olmsted Brothers to design a parkway, the first section of the boulevard, through the park because they owned all the land and they could move forward with it. And Olmsted balked at that. He was appalled that they would ask him to design a drive and then later do a park around it. He said, no, you design the park and then you put the drive through it. But the Board of Park Commissioners really wanted to have something that they could show the public to build support for this park system idea. And so the Olmsted Brothers acquiesced. And one of the things that I love many things about Washington Park, but is that entryway at Madison Avenue. If you go, or Madison Street, sorry. If you go to that entrance, you'll see in the lower left, there's a detail from this larger plan and the trees that were chosen for the entryway. And here they are in 1934, just getting filled out. And then, oops, oh, sorry, there it is, 2008. That is a more current picture. Those trees are the ones that Olmsted intended. And I love how that is a transition between the more formal surroundings of the neighborhood into the landscape. As you get farther into the Arboretum, of course, it becomes more informal and the plantings are softer in there. You don't see those lines of trees like you do right at the entrance. So Lake Washington Boulevard was developed as quickly as possible in time for the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, because the reason you have a World's Fair is to attract people to your city. And Seattleites knew that one of the best attractive devices they had was how beautiful it is here. And that Lakeshore Drive was going to be a very important part of that. They wanted it to go from Seward Park all the way to the university, by 1909. They didn't quite get there because of challenges with acquiring the property, but they eventually did, and then it is anchored on one end by Seward Park and on the other end by Washington Park and the Montlake area. And it's interesting to note, if you look at the picture in the upper left, see how the water comes right up there to the edge. This is before the ship canal, the Montlake Cut, opened, and so before the lake is lowered. And then when the lake was lowered, Olmsted suggested that they might ask, the Board of Park Commissioners might ask the state legislature to pass a law that as they were selling off the shorelands in preparation for the exposition, they used that money to fund the exposition, that if they put a proviso in that bill that said any land, any shoreland that was adjacent to city-owned land would transfer to the city at no cost, then property owners could donate land along the shore and thereby amplify their donation and create that park space at very little cost to the city. The exhibition planners were not thrilled by that because, of course, there's their funding source being eaten away at. But Olmsted argued that they can find another source for that money. It's more important that you get that land for the park system. And that is part of the reason today why we have that amazing buffer of land between Lake Washington Boulevard and the lake, and so much of that lakeshore access. Frink Park is another one of the lakeshore parks that comes along the boulevard. This is one, I love this photo of the automobiles because, of course, this is right in the era when automobiles are entering Seattle. And Lake Washington Boulevard winds its way through the park. And here in this photo, it has an elegance, it is a beautiful space, but then you see it today, and it's amazing. This is the bridge in Frink Park today, and if you haven't been there or if you haven't paid attention to that particular bridge when you go by, please do. In the 1980s, the railing was repaired. I think Donald Harris this year, he was at the head of that effort. That bridge took a bit of a beating. One of the railings had been damaged beyond repair, and so they'd replaced it with that horrible metal bumper guard. And through the efforts of Donald Harris, who was working at Parks, and other folks, that was replaced. They rebuilt it out of concrete using the plans, and now it is an absolutely beautiful little ravine to walk through. Coleman Park is another one. This one, I have a particularly soft spot. I love the separation of circulation in this park, the separation of grades. If you start at the top of Coleman Park and work your way down to the lake, pedestrians go down through the middle of the ravine, and the boulevard does a serpentine through, and it's so well designed, and you get such an experience of either on foot or in vehicles. And that's something that the city really struggled with, is how to get enough land and create enough space to have both pedestrian and vehicle pathways on the boulevards. They weren't always able to do that, but Coleman Park is a particularly good example of that. And then, of course, Seward Park, which is its function in the park system is that it is an enclave of our forests, the forest that used to cover most of the city. And Olmsted recognized that that was something that was worth saving, and that it would be different than all the other parks, and that it would be more isolated and less developed, except for along the edges. This plan, you can see, particularly on this left-hand side, there were lots of facilities that were planned for this park. Seward Park was not fully developed according to the Olmsted plan. I never found the actual smoking gun, but I found lots of letters with Olmsted or Fred Dawson, who was his associate here, often in his stead, complaining about Jacob Umlauf, who was a head gardener. He was at Seward Park when this plan was developed. And there is definite implications that Umlauf was actively pushing back against the Olmsted vision and undermining the implementation of this plan. But I never could find the actual documentation, so I have to say that with a caveat, but I'm pretty sure we didn't get everything we wanted in Seward Park because of Jacob Umlauf. And so that is the sort of that backbone of the park system that goes between Seward Park and Washington Park, but that is not at all that the Olmsted Park system is. It extends throughout the city. This is Schmidt Park, one of my favorites. I love doing walking tours in Schmidt Park. Again, another forest reserve, much smaller scale than Seward Park, but still very magical. It's in a very tight ravine. This plan is when the Boulevard ended in the middle of the park. Olmsted designed it so there would be a turnaround. And it's an interesting hybrid. There is the forest reserve part of the park, but then you can see that these trees are lined up right in a row. And if you go to Schmidt Park, you can still see these trees planted this way. And so it's that transition again between a neighborhood parkway into a park landscape. And it's pretty amazing. It's, the neighborhood has done a tremendous amount of work, the Friends group there, in helping the Parks Department restore this landscape. And so it's changed quite a bit over the years, but the basic form of it is the same, and you still get the connection between Schmidt Park, which is forested, and then you move down the hill and you go to Alki Playground, which is a meadow-like field, and then you keep going and you end up at Alki Beach, which is pretty freaking amazing. Only in Seattle do you get that string of events, and so, or that string of experiences, and so you see that throughout the city where there's different places. The Jefferson Park, Cheesty Boulevard, Mount Baker neighborhood, Mount Baker Park, Lake Washington Boulevard string is another one that is an absolutely magical combination of things you can only experience in this city, and we are so lucky to have that public access to all of those landscapes. We also have playfields throughout the city. Hiawatha Playfield was the first one developed with the fully developed vision of a field house, program spaces for ball fields and gymnastic equipment and small children's playfields. But you'll notice in that plan that the upper left corner is fairly open. It's lawn with tree, and that is that idea. And you can see it wraps all the way around in a smaller wedge, that it's not just a ball field slapped onto the landscape. It is encompassed by a park-like atmosphere, so that even if those kids didn't mean to, they were being exposed to that restorative character, and neighborhood members, of course, could enjoy that part of the park also. And so what you see is, I'll go back to this map. This is the 1908 plan, and it's awfully familiar. The parks that are outlined here are largely ones that we can identify and that have helped shape our neighborhoods. And the transportation infrastructure that built around it. But it's really amazing how that vision worked out for our city. It helped shape not only how we live in our small neighborhoods, but how we visit other neighborhoods. I don't know how often I would go to Capitol Hill if it wasn't for Volunteer Park. I wouldn't just necessarily wander the streets, but I get to go and enjoy that beautiful community by going to Volunteer Park, and it pulls me into that way of experiencing our city and getting to see that amazing view across the reservoir and out to the Olympic Mountains. And so it's pretty remarkable that we have this park system. The trick now is looking at those areas that were not fully developed and seeing how we can fill that gap analysis. The park department certainly works on this nearly continuously, but it's always something to keep in mind as those places that did not get the full realization of the Olmsted vision, how we can support the development of those landscapes. And then that was not the end of the Olmsted story in Seattle. John Olmsted died in 1920, but his associate, Fred Dawson, who was a very gregarious person, he was well-liked. He worked often on the private residences that the Olmstead Brothers firm did in Seattle as sort of a supplemental activity when they were in Seattle. That's part of what made it work for the Olmstead Brothers to come all the way to the West Coast from Massachusetts. And through that private work, Fred Dawson got to know Sophie Krause. They did the Krause home on Lake Washington Boulevard. And so in 1934, when the park department was able to get funding from the WPA to develop Washington Park, which had essentially been the drive plus a few other facilities, and they wanted to develop it into an arboretum, the Seattle Garden Club was involved in helping make that happen, because Sophie Krause was a member of the Garden Club, and they paid for the cost of having Dawson from the Olmstead Brothers firm create the plan for the Arboretum. And so all the way into the 20s, you see that activity, and in the 30s, you see that activity going on, and correspondence between Fred Dawson and members of the Board of Park Commissioners. And so the Arboretum plan is too extensive to go into here, but I will just point out one element that's particularly remarkable. The Speedway, which was a horse track in the middle of Washington Park, which is impossible to imagine. Dawson looked at that graded landscape and thought, well, what should I make out of that? And he came up with an idea, and they did all this clearing work because they had that WPA labor. And he developed a plan for Azalea Way, which we now experience today as that amazing walk through the middle of Washington Park, and that vision that all of those flowering trees and plants would create this amazing spring landscape that would then evolve through the course of the seasons. And we get to enjoy that today. So it's interesting to me that the Seattle Garden Club, to celebrate their centennial, installed a new garden at the southern end of Azalea Way. And it's kind of a nice connection between their support of Dawson's work in the Arboretum. So I will end, going a little bit longer than I intended, I will end with just talking about all of these different parks that we have. We have access to all these amazing views and beautiful spaces. This is the Rose Garden in Woodland Park. But they're hard to maintain. They take a lot of people. I found one source that said that we used to have 23 gardeners in Volunteer Park, and now there is 1.5, plus the volunteer labor of the Volunteer Park Trust, of course. And so that investing in human labor and committing to having those planting beds that are fairly elaborate and keeping up with invasive plants and keeping up with aging trees and looking at the future of climate change and how it's going to affect our parks. And then just the population pressure of the ever-growing city. And I think of Woodland Park in particular, the pathways through the center of Woodland Park. It's beautiful. It's a lovely park. But if you think about what Olmsted, if you read the quotes about what he valued about that, it was the thick, lush forest and the meandering paths that were carried people through that forest and gave them that experience. It's not a complex forest anymore. It is a very well-loved forest, and those paths are just being beaten to death. And it's expensive to maintain those things. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do is that when the park department wants to invest in maintenance, and that's not the glamorous, shiniest thing that maybe we want to invest in, support them, encourage them, because those things are going to keep those essential Olmsted elements that we know and love. And on that note, oh, sorry, one more. This is Bicycle Sunday, Lake Washington Boulevard. If you have not done that before, highly encourage it. So I'll end with, there are so many ways to get involved with Olmsted Parks in Seattle. First is enjoy them, of course. Second is to read the book and learn the story. It's a pretty fabulous story. And then get involved with the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks or the Volunteer Park Trust, or if you have an Olmsted Park in your neighborhood, there are often friends of groups that are doing tremendously good work for those parks. You can find connections to a lot of those things on the FSOP website, which is seattleolmsted.org. If you want to learn more stories about the park system that I couldn't fit into the book, you can go to HistoryLink.org, where the Washington State Encyclopedia, it's online, accessible at no cost. And I just have to do a shout out to Documentary Media for the beautiful work they did, and the University of Washington Press for helping us distribute this book, which is a tremendous tool that we are able to use because we'd be hard pressed on our own to get this book out. So thank you to everyone for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions. Sure. So the question was to talk a little bit more about the development of Green Lake Park, which is interestingly known in the Olmsted records as Green Lake Boulevard, because the original impetus for developing that was as a trolley line and boulevard around the park. And it took quite a while for the vision to coalesce. The lake was lowered. That area that the soccer fields on the east side of the park, that was lowered and diked and then filled. The field house, community center, the pool and the community center come much later. But Olmsted's vision for that was that it's adjacent to Woodland Park. It's a place, of course, a body of water within the city. There's so few places on the saltwater shoreline that could be reserved for park. He walked up and down Elliott Bay, the shoreline, trying to find some place that could be made into a shoreline park. And so he really knew the value of having that lake reserved for public access. And so over time, with the lowering of the lake, he wanted the creek that ran from Green Lake to Ravenna Park to be left daylighted, and he wanted Ravenna Boulevard to be a traditional boulevard with a drive on either side, and then in the middle, he wanted the creek to meander its way all the way to Ravenna Park. That did not happen because the lake was lowered more than he intended, and so they went a different way with that. But you still get the vision of all the way, the connectivity then to Cowan and Ravenna Park, and that was part of that. Yeah. So the question is about the current work on the waterfront and whether that might follow the Olmsted vision. Happily, over time, a few things have been developed that match what Olmsted hoped for, and you can find it in his field notes and his correspondence, and in the 1903 plan. The area where Steinbrook Park is, that was one of the areas that Olmsted called for being parkland because it was over the Great Northern Tunnel portal, and he felt that the warehouse level below the actual shoreline warehouses would never grow up to block that view, and so it was a great place to reserve. That, of course, didn't happen until much later, after the armory that was there was taken out, but happily that has been turned into a park. The area where the Battery Street Tunnel exited, or entered, I guess, depending on your perspective. That, as far as I understand it, is going to be turned into parkland. That was another area that he thought perhaps that just that shoulder of the hill that you could have those views out. The sculpture park, to a degree, fulfills the vision of, it fulfills the vision for having a shoreline park, but it's in a slightly different place than Olmsted intended. And so I think Olmsted didn't specifically call for something like Waterfront Park that we have today, because that at the time was right in the thick of an incredibly densely populated industrial area. He looked more at the northern part of the shoreline. But also if you think of where Myrtle Edwards Park is and Centennial Park, which is a Port of Seattle park, those also give that shoreline access that Olmsted hoped for. Okay, so the question is how we did pretty well with our implementation of the Olmsted plan. How did we do relative to other cities? Tacoma, unfortunately, did not get their Olmsted plan. They had one that was developed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. in 1873, but it was not implemented at all. Spokane has a remarkable park system. It wasn't exactly fulfilled as Olmsted intended. And of course, I-5 did damage to their park system, but they have a pretty remarkable set of Olmsted parks. I have to say, I hope there's nobody from these other towns in our midst, but we did really, really well. We have an amazing, intricate web of parks and parkways, and there's 83 parks in Seattle that have a connection to the Olmsted vision at varying degrees, and we've done a fairly good job of protecting them. They're struggling with perhaps overuse, but generally speaking, you can still see Olmsted in our park system. When you look at the plans, it's very familiar to what we live with. And so I would say a little bit as a Seattleite that we did pretty awesome, but also being more objective that generally speaking, we did well. So the question is looking at Woodland Park and Green Lake Park at the trees that are really struggling in those landscapes. I am not an arborist, so I would hesitate to try and name what's going on, but I know that I've heard in talking with the Parks Department, tree folks, and with the Green Seattle Partnership people who are working on reforesting our parks, it is a constant challenge of trying to keep up with aging trees and with the effects of climate change and just the ailments of trees. There's a lot of trees to care for. I do know that there are a lot of people working on it, and it's if we could just fund it more, always, more money would be amazing. Yeah. So the question is about the cherry trees along Lake Washington Boulevard between Seward Park, and they go north. I don't think they go all the way to Genesee, but it's somewhere just north of Seward Park. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly where they stop. But those were not part of the original Olmsted plan, so perhaps they should be removed. And there is where you enter the thicket of cultural landscape preservation. There are lots of opinions on that sort of thing. My personal opinion is that the landscapes are living their lives, and they live in a community. There are layers of history on these landscapes. We have the pre-Olmsted era, we have the Olmsted era, we have all the things that have happened since. And I would be loath to pull out trees because they were not in the Olmsted plan. However, as things have to change, say as those trees age out, I think it's worth having a discussion of have those become such an iconic element in the landscape that they should be saved because they are historical in their own sense? Or should we take the opportunity to restore more of the Olmsted vision, which would have been more native plants, less lawn, a very different vision for what the lakeshore should look like? And so I think you have to take it case by case and really consider kind of the cultural significance of whatever element you're looking for. But then as change happens, try not to do harm to the Olmsted vision. So try not to plant a wall of vegetation along the lakeshore because salmon love that, and that is a very important goal. But as long as you leave parts that have views so that you can still get that expansive view across the water that Olmsted intended, I think you can find a good balance. Around Andrews Bay and Seward Park, FSOP worked with the Parks Department to find a balance between salmon habitat needs and the Olmsted vision, which was very much that you could see across the water from those shorelines. And I think it worked out really well. If you go check it out, it's a nice hybrid between the two. Question is in the 1908 plan, which I'll go back to, you'll see in the Duwamish River Valley that the Duwamish meanders. You can also see the line where they are drawing what the Duwamish waterway would become. They were already planning to do that. So the river originally meandered, and they were planning to make the waterway out of it, very much looking for commercial waterway space next to level land, which is at a premium in Seattle. And Olmsted did not, as far as I'm aware, comment on whether they should have that river meander or should go straight. Instead, he looked at spaces in those neighborhoods that would serve the needs of the community. And I'm flipping through my brain. I don't remember coming across anywhere where he specifically said the waterway was important for a landscape that he was designating, but I would need to look back to see. I honestly can't remember. But that is one of the challenges, is filling, straightening, widening waterways in Seattle has had an impact. Where Genesee Park used to be a marsh. It was a slough before the lowering of the lake. And so that landscape was pretty radically altered. So there's places like that. Of course, also Foster Island and the digging and all of the removing of soil and adding soil for the 520 bridge all have had impact. So, yeah. So the question is about Jefferson Park and the idea of playfields there. Was it already clear cut, and were the reservoirs there? So yes, the first cutover of logging had already happened in that area, and the neighbors were burning their lots, as Seattleites did in that era to clear them. And so, and then also the reservoir, the water system was already in place. There's a really interesting story about the intersection between the water system and the park system that is a whole nother talk that we could give just on that. Yeah. So he was looking at a landscape that was already fairly altered when he was looking at what should be done with it. Okay, well, that looks like that's good. Thank you so much.